Mirabel's excitement was palpable as she stood before the mirror, adjusting her hair one last time before meeting the woman she had heard so much about, her fiancé's mother, Mrs. Benson. The wedding was just around the corner, and this meeting was supposed to seal everything, a blend of two families, two worlds, a new chapter. But Mirabel had no idea what awaited her. As she arrived at the Benson residence, a grand house that smelled of tradition and old money, her nerves began to creep in. She tried to shake them off, reminding herself that this was her fiancé's family. After all, they were about to become her family too. When Mrs. Benson walked into the room, Mirabel felt her breath catch. Mrs. Benson was a woman of striking presence, with sharp features that demanded attention. Her eyes were calculating, her smile warm but forced, like a mask that hid something deeper. She greeted Mirabel with a tight hug that didn't feel like a motherly embrace, more like a test of territory. It was clear this woman was used to being in control. "I'm so happy to finally meet you, Mirabel," Mrs. Benson said with an air of superiority. "I've heard so much about you from Kelvin." Mirabel smiled politely, trying to ignore the unease gnawing at her insides. She had expected the typical, warm welcome from a mother of a man she was about to marry, but Mrs. Benson was different. She quickly launched into a detailed discussion about the wedding plans, but Mirabel was stunned as she realized that Mrs. Benson wasn't asking for her opinion. She was telling her how things would be. "We've already chosen the color scheme," Mrs. Benson said firmly. "White and gold, nothing bold." Mirabel hesitated. "I had in mind something modern, with blue or purple." Mrs. Benson dismissed her. "No, we don't need bold colors. It's my son's wedding, and I know best." Mirabel quickly realized Mrs. Benson had already planned everything, leaving her no room to contribute. Kelvin wasn't even present to defend her. Days after their first meeting, tension built. Mirabel confronted Kelvin. "You've been so quiet, just deferring to your mother," she said, frustrated. "Why can't you stand up to her?" Kelvin looked conflicted. "She's always been there. I don't want to upset her." Mirabel was exasperated. "She's controlling you. You're supposed to be marrying me, not her." Kelvin fell silent, unable to explain the bond that tied him to his mother. Mrs. Benson's control over the wedding intensified when she demanded the color scheme be changed again. Mirabel, frustrated, pushed back. "I want something modern, not outdated," she said. "Gold and cream are too traditional." But Mrs. Benson was resolute. "This is my son's wedding, and you'll respect the choices I've made." Kelvin, always trying to avoid conflict, suggested a compromise, but Mirabel could see the distance growing between them. Mrs. Benson's interference didn't stop with the wedding details. She took over the guest list, dictated the venue, and insisted on a traditional bridal gown for Mirabel. When Mirabel refused to wear it, Mrs. Benson's fury was palpable. "You'll wear it," she said. "This is my family's tradition." Kelvin, torn, suggested they find a middle ground, but it was clear Mirabel's wishes weren't being heard. One afternoon, Mirabel arrived at Kelvin's house and was shocked to find him bathing with his mother, who was scrubbing his back like a child. "Why is your mother bathing you?" Mirabel asked, hurt. Kelvin looked embarrassed. "It's nothing, Mirabel. She just likes to make sure I'm comfortable." Mirabel, frustrated, snapped, "This is too much, Kelvin. You're a grown man. Why are you letting her control you like this?" Mrs. Benson, unfazed, explained it was just their family dynamic. Mirabel, heartbroken, left, realizing she couldn't marry a man so dependent on his mother. The days following the bathtub incident were tense. Mirabel's emotions were in turmoil. She loved Kelvin, but Mrs. Benson's control over every aspect of their wedding left her feeling sidelined. One evening, Mirabel met Kelvin at a cafe. Her resolve to speak up was firm. "Kelvin, we need to talk about your mother," she began. Kelvin glanced up, already defensive. "I've told you, it's complicated." "No, Kelvin, it's not," she retorted. "Your mother is controlling every detail of our wedding. It's supposed to be our day, yet she's decided the colors, gown, and guest list." "I feel erased." Kelvin fidgeted, guilt evident. "She means well. She's always been there for me. And I'm supposed to be your partner now," Mirabel pressed. "You need to choose, Kelvin. It's either her or me." Silence hung between them as Kelvin stared at his coffee. Mirabel's words echoed in his mind, and for the first time, he saw the cracks in their relationship. The breaking point came when Mrs. Benson attended Mirabel's dress-fitting uninvited, demanding last-minute changes to the gown. No, absolutely not, Mirabel snapped, stepping between Mrs. Benson and the seamstress. Mrs. Benson smiled coldly. I'm just ensuring the wedding is perfect, dear. It's my son's big day too. This wedding is about both of us, not just Kelvin. Mirabel fired back. Mrs. Benson turned to Kelvin. Why are you letting her behave this way? She needs to understand her place. Kelvin froze, unable to speak. Mirabel saw his indecision and felt her heart break. She whispered, I'm done, Kelvin. I deserve someone who stands by me. Ignoring Mrs. Benson's protests, Mirabel walked out, leaving her dreams of a life with Kelvin behind. The weeks after the breakup were agonizing. Mirabel threw herself into work to distract from the pain. Meanwhile, Kelvin called repeatedly, but she refused to answer. She needed space to heal and move on. Without Mirabel, Kelvin faced Mrs. Benson's unchecked control. Yet, Mirabel learned an invaluable lesson. Love alone wasn't enough if it required sacrificing her happiness. Unable to bear her silence, Kelvin showed up at Mirabel's apartment. His face, etched with desperation, softened as she opened the door. Mirabel, please, hear me out, he begged. I can't, Kelvin. I won't fight your mother for your attention anymore, she said, arms crossed. I know I failed you, Kelvin admitted. I let her control everything. But I can change. I'll set boundaries. I'll choose us. Mirabel's heart wavered. Kelvin, I hope you mean that. But actions speak louder than words. I'll prove it, he promised. Kelvin's attempts to set boundaries angered Mrs. Benson. She sent manipulative texts, urging him to reconsider his relationship. You'll regret this, one message read. When Kelvin visited her to talk, Mrs. Benson unleashed her frustration. She's tearing us apart. Don't let her ruin everything we've built. Kelvin stood firm. Mom, I love her. You need to let me live my life. Her icy glare promised retaliation. Kelvin left, knowing the battle was far from over. The tension escalated as the wedding approached. Mrs. Benson continued to make unilateral decisions, rejecting Mirabel's lavender and white color scheme for flashy gold and red. This is too much, Mirabel told Kelvin one evening. Your mother is turning our wedding into her project. You're letting her. Please, understand, Kelvin pleaded. She's been through a lot. She just wants what's best for me. No, Kelvin, Mirabel said firmly. She wants what's best for her. If you can't stand up to her now, how will this ever work? Kelvin's hesitation spoke volumes. Mirabel sighed, tears in her eyes. If you can't choose us, then we shouldn't go through with this wedding. Despite their arguments, Mirabel tried to salvage the wedding. But each day brought more frustration. Mrs. Benson rejected Mirabel's ideas and refused to compromise. When Kelvin failed to stand up to his mother, Mirabel knew the truth. Their love wasn't strong enough to overcome Mrs. Benson's grip. Kelvin, this isn't a partnership, she said one evening. I need someone who puts me first. I can't do this anymore. Kelvin begged her to reconsider, but Mirabel's mind was made up. She left, knowing she deserved better. Kelvin couldn't sleep, overwhelmed by the hurt and disappointment in Mirabel's eyes. He had lost her. Desperate, he sent a heartfelt message. Mirabel, I'm so sorry. I've been an idiot. I let my mother control me, and I lost sight of what matters. I love you. Please, let me show you I can be the man you deserve. I need you. Kelvin stared at the message. Would she reply? His phone buzzed after what felt like forever. It was Mirabel. Kelvin, I've been thinking. I don't know if I can fully forgive you, but if you're serious about changing, prove it. But I won't wait forever. Kelvin exhaled, hope rising. Maybe there was a chance after all. Kelvin's heart raced as he read Mirabel's message. Her words stung, but they weren't a rejection. The next morning, he called his mother, his hands trembling. Kelvin, Mrs. Benson answered, her tone cold. What now? I need to talk, Mom. About everything, he said, his voice steady. About the wedding, about Mirabel. I'm choosing my life now. Mrs. Benson's silence was deafening. Finally, she replied, her voice cold. You'll regret this, Kelvin. But do what you must. For the first time, Kelvin felt a sense of freedom. It was done. Kelvin went to Mirabel's apartment, determined to make things right. She opened the door, guarded but curious. I know I've hurt you, he began. But I want to prove I can be the man you deserve. Mirabel crossed her arms, skepticism in her eyes. Words are easy. How can I believe you? Calvin pulled out a letter and placed it on the table. I've made arrangements to move out. I've cut ties with my mother's control. This is my first step towards proving that I'm choosing you. Mirabel's eyes widened. This was more than just words, it was a commitment. She read the letter in silence. Calvin was serious. I don't know what to say, she whispered. This is a huge step, but I need more than this. I need time to see if you're really ready. Calvin nodded. I understand. I'll prove it every day. Mirabel hesitated, then spoke. All right, but this is your last chance. Calvin smiled, relieved. Thank you. I won't regret it. As weeks passed, Calvin proved he was serious. He moved into an apartment, sought therapy, and began asserting his independence. Mrs. Benson was furious but realized that her son was no longer under her control. Mirabel watched, cautiously allowing herself to believe in the changes. One afternoon, as they sat in the park, Calvin said, I want us to build something real, together. Mirabel smiled. I just need to know you'll keep fighting for us. Calvin's eyes were filled with determination. I will. I won't stop fighting for us. For the first time, Mirabel felt a glimmer of hope. Mrs. Benson continued her manipulations, but Calvin stood firm. The ultimate test came when she showed up at his apartment, furious. You've made a mistake, Calvin, she hissed. You'll regret this. But this time, Calvin didn't flinch. No, Mom, I've already lost enough. I won't lose my happiness and my future with Mirabel. He felt truly free. He had made his choice. The wedding day was near, and Mirabel was overwhelmed with emotions. She had given Calvin a second chance, but doubts lingered. Mrs. Benson's meddling continued, despite Mirabel's refusals on every decision. One morning, Mrs. Benson tried to take control again. We need to make the wedding grand, for the family, she said sweetly. Mom, we've been over this, Calvin replied firmly. The wedding is Mirabel's day. You need to respect that. Mrs. Benson sneered. You'll regret this. Calvin stood tall. I'm marrying Mirabel, and nothing you do will change that. Mirabel walked down the aisle, nervous but relieved. As she saw Calvin, her doubts melted away. This was their moment. Mrs. Benson sat in the front row, her expression tense. During the ceremony, she abruptly stood up, declaring, this wedding is a mistake. You belong with your family, not her. Calvin stepped forward, his voice strong. No, Mom, this is my choice. Mirabel is my future. Mrs. Benson fell silent, defeated. Calvin turned back to Mirabel. I'm here. I'm ready to marry you. Mirabel smiled, tears in her eyes. I'm ready too. The officiant cleared his throat. We can continue now. As they exchanged vows, Mirabel knew they had triumphed over the biggest obstacle they'd ever face, which was Mrs. Benson.